The Atlantic Yards development project in Brooklyn, New York, was approved by the state of New York in December 2006 as a 17-acre mixed-use development in the Prospect Heights neighborhood adjacent to the Atlantic Terminal Transit Hub, comprising a professional basketball arena, 16 residential towers, commercial office space, and public open space, with a projected total investment of approximately $4.9 billion and a projected completion timeline of 10 years. The Barclays Center arena opened in September 2012. As of the time this episode was produced, 18 years after the project's approval, the residential development component designed to surround the arena and create the mixed-use neighborhood the arena was intended to anchor has not been completed. Several of the 16 residential towers have been built. Several have not been built. The public open space that was part of the original approval has not been fully delivered. The commercial office component has not been constructed. The arena stands in Prospect Heights. The neighborhood it was designed to anchor does not yet exist in the form the approval documents described. The forensic entry point is not the arena's commercial success, which is genuine. The Barclays Center hosts approximately 200 dates of programming per year and serves as the home arena for the Brooklyn Nets. The forensic entry point is the relationship between a sports arena and the mixed-use development it is designed to anchor, and the specific mechanism by which a politically approved, publicly subsidized, privately developed urban project can deliver its most politically visible component, while the community development outcomes that justified the public approvals and the public subsidies remain undelivered after 16 years. The arena was built. The neighborhood was not. Those two facts, held simultaneously, document a failure mode that this channel has not previously examined in this specific form. The completion of the headline anchor component of a mixed-use development, while the community outcomes the anchor was supposed to catalyze, remain undelivered significantly beyond the timeline. The approval process established as the project's commitment to the public. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. The Atlantic Yards project's development history, between its 2006 approval and its current partially completed state, reflects the specific challenges of large-scale urban development in New York City and the specific way in which those challenges interact with the political economy of sports arena development. The arena component of the Atlantic Yards project was the element that justified the project's political approvals from the perspective of Bruce Ratner's Forest City Ratner Companies, the original developer. The arena was the commercial engine whose naming rights revenue, event income, and Nets franchise value provided the financial foundation that made the broader development's equity returns achievable. The residential towers were the community benefit components, whose delivery was the political justification for the extraordinary public approvals the project required. The use of eminent domain to acquire properties in the project footprint, the override of New York City zoning through state agency approval, and the public subsidies that the project received from both city and state sources. The covenant embedded in the project approval was explicit. The residential towers, including significant affordable housing components, would be built on a timeline that the approval documents specified as 10 years from the project's commencement. That covenant was not honored on the specified timeline. The specific mechanism by which the covenant was not honored reflects the structural relationship between the arena component and the residential component in the project's financial architecture. The arena was financed by the arena's revenue. The residential towers were financed by the residential towers' revenue. The two financing streams were structurally independent, which meant that the arena's commercial success did not generate the capital required to develop the residential towers on any timeline other than the one that the residential market and the residential financing market would support. The residential market in Brooklyn in the period following the arena's opening was active. The residential financing market was available. The residential towers were not built at the pace that the approval commitment had required. The delays reflected a combination of development complexity, financing market conditions, and the specific challenges of constructing modular high-rise residential buildings in a dense urban context. At what point does a developer's failure to deliver community benefit components on the timeline that justified public approvals constitute a breach of the public trust that authorized the project? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that governed the Atlantic Yards project approval incorporated an economic impact analysis whose projections treated the arena and the residential development as a unified development whose combined economic benefits to Brooklyn and to New York City justified the public subsidies and the extraordinary approvals the project required. The economic impact analysis that supported the approval projected job creation, tax revenue generation, and community development outcomes that assumed the full development's completion on the 10-year timeline the approval documents established. The appraisal failure in this case is not in the economic impact methodology's internal logic. Given the full development's completion on the projected timeline, the economic impact projections were not unreasonable representations of what the completed project would generate. The appraisal failure was in the treatment of the completion timeline as a committed deliverable, rather than as a projection whose achievement depended on market conditions, financing availability, and development execution that the approval process had not independently validated. The specific difference between the Meadowlands American Dream case documented in Case File 032 and the Atlantic Yards case is instructive here. The American Dream case documented a project that was completed but opened into a market that had changed during the construction period. The Atlantic Yards case documents a project that has been partially completed and whose unbuilt components remain unbuilt because the development execution and financing conditions required for their construction have not been consistently available at the pace the approval commitment had established. Both cases document a gap between the development timeline that the approval process established and the timeline that the development market produced. The gap in the American Dream case was closed by eventual completion into a changed market. The gap in the Atlantic Yards case has not yet been closed, 16 years after the project's approval. The arena stands. The towers that were supposed to surround it are partially standing. The public space that was supposed to connect them has not been fully delivered. The affordable housing commitments that justified the approval remain partially unfulfilled. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. The Atlantic Yards project's renaming to Pacific Park Brooklyn in 2014, following the sale of the Forest City Ratner development interest to Greenland USA, a subsidiary of the Chinese state-owned Greenland Group, documented the specific moment at which the original developer's capacity to deliver the residential components on the approved timeline had become incompatible with the project's continued political and community relationships. Forest City Ratner had built the arena. The arena was the developer's primary commercial interest. The residential towers and the affordable housing components were the community benefit obligations, whose delivery had been the political justification for the extraordinary approvals the project required. The eminent domain acquisitions, the state agency override of city zoning, and the public subsidies from both city and state sources. The transition to Greenland USA transferred those community benefit obligations to a development entity whose institutional relationships with Brooklyn's community advocacy organizations and with the political and regulatory structure whose ongoing approval the project's community benefit delivery required were qualitatively different from the relationships the original developer had established over a decade of project advocacy. The institutional denial embedded in the Atlantic Yards development process is systemic rather than individual. No single actor in the project's development history made a decision whose explicit content was to prioritize the arena over the residential towers. The pattern emerged from the cumulative effect of individual decisions that each treated the arena's commercial timeline and the residential tower's development timeline as governed by different standards of urgency and accountability. The arena opened in September 2012, 6 years after the project's 2006 approval, within a time frame that the project's political sponsors characterized as a success. The residential towers have been delivered at a pace whose distance from the 10-year completion commitment. The approval documents established has been characterized by the project's various ownership structures as a reflection of development complexity, financing market conditions, and construction execution challenges, rather than as a breach of the commitment the project's public approvals required. The arena anchors Prospect Heights. The neighborhood the approval promised to build around it is still being assembled piece by piece, 18 years after the process that committed to its delivery in 10. The specific accountability failure is simple. The community benefit obligation that justified the public approval was not enforced at the same standard as the commercial component whose delivery justified the developer's investment. That asymmetry is the forensic signature of the Atlantic Yards case, and it is a signature that appears in the public record of every political meeting, every oversight hearing, and every developer communication about the project's timeline across 18 years of partial delivery. The Barclays Center continues to operate as one of the most commercially successful arenas in the United States, generating revenues that validate the financial thesis that Bruce Ratner had presented to the New York political and community structure when the project's approvals were being assembled. The Pacific Park Brooklyn residential development continues to be built at a pace that the current ownership and development partnerships have characterized as consistent with the market conditions and financing constraints that contemporary New York City residential construction faces. What the Atlantic Yards case reveals in the context of this channel's 57 case archive is the specific failure mode of mixed-use development in which the politically visible anchor component is delivered while the community development outcomes that justify the anchor's public approvals are delivered on a timeline that the approval commitment did not establish as acceptable. This case file documents the gap between what political approvals promise and what development markets deliver, in a context where the anchor component's commercial success insulates the overall project from the accountability mechanisms that would otherwise enforce the community benefit commitments. The arena is there. The arena works. The arena generates revenue and provides entertainment and anchors the Prospect Heights neighborhood's identity as a destination. The neighborhood that the approval process promised to build around it remains partially constructed, 18 years after the political process that committed to its 10-year delivery. The forensic lesson of the Atlantic Yards case is not that mixed-use development is impossible, or that sports arenas cannot anchor neighborhood development. The lesson is that the accountability mechanism for community benefit delivery in politically approved development projects must be applied with the same enforcement consistency as the accountability mechanism for the anchor component's delivery, and that when those two accountability standards are applied asymmetrically, the anchor gets built and the community gets a promise that the development market delivers on its own timeline, rather than on the timeline the community's political representatives negotiated. If this case file changed how you evaluate the relationship between sports arena development and mixed-use community outcomes, subscribe, because the next case examines a stadium whose public finance was even more extraordinary and whose community development outcomes were even more specifically promised. And in the comments, given the Atlantic Yards project's documented delivery of the arena on the commercial timeline and the residential towers on a substantially delayed timeline, what specific accountability mechanism should be required in all politically approved mixed-use developments to ensure that community benefit components are delivered on the timeline that justified the approvals? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.